Burge has accepted our invitation to close the seminar. As everybody knows, Burge is professor in the University of California at Los Angeles, and is very famous for his anti-individualistic conception of mental conflict. So, Burge, please.
Thank you. The title of the talk is Do Apes and Very Young Children Attribute Mental States? A widespread view among philosophers and psychologists is that apes and human children, well under the age of 4, have been shown to have rudimentary capacities for representing and attributing mental or psychological states. This view is disputed, but most of its critics have mounted contrary positive views that either have been refuted or seem less promising. I believe that the widespread view is mistaken. I think that we do not know whether non-human animals, particularly apes, attribute mental states at all. I think that we do not yet know at what stage human children attribute mental states. I think that the best conjecture, given present evidence, is that human children attribute mental states between ages 3 and 6 years old. I think that the main difficulties with the widespread view are conceptual. There is a correlative failure to recognize what is needed to show that an individual attributes mental states, and a failure to recognize the power and adequacy of alternative explanations of the empirical evidence that do not take apes and very young children to attribute mental states. The methodological upshot of my talk will be that developmental psychologists, primatologists, and cognitive neuroscientists need to develop more sophisticated conceptions of mental kinds and correspondingly more sophisticated experimental methods for delineating such kinds if a lasting understanding of the phylogeny and ontogeny of mind is to be achieved. There are 3 main sources of weakness in background assumptions about mental or psychological states by proponents of the widespread view. First, there is a failure to disentangle attributions of psychologically guided action from attributions of action that do not represent the action as psychologically guided. Many psychologists and primatologists recognize the distinction between action attributions that do and do not attribute psychological states or psychological sources of action. However, the recognition is commonly associated with oversimple conceptions of the resources for understanding action without attributing mental sources for the action. A lot of action in the animal world is guided and caused by non-mental cognitive states. The action is goal-oriented. It has a target. It is not stimulus response level behavior, but the agent never represents a goal or target. Careful thought about such action would improve theorizing about early mentalistic attribution. Of course, very young children and apes respond to actions that are in fact guided by psychological states. The issue is whether they attribute psychological states that guide the action. Second, there's a failure to distinguish perceiving from sensing, and a failure to recognize that sensing is not in itself a mental or psychological state. Primitive organisms have sensory capacities. These capacities do not imply consciousness or representation in any distinctively psychological sense of representation. Consciousness and representation in the psychological sense are the basic marks of mind. Sensory states function to causally covary with entities in the environment and to figure in engendering action. But functioning causal covariation, which is what I call information registration, is not representation in any distinctively psychological sense. As we shall see, sensing can mislead without representing anything. Third, There's a failure to distinguish types and levels of psychological states: perception, perceptual anticipation, perceptual memory, belief, propositional memory, non-propositional transitions, propositional inference, all kinds of different levels and types of mental states and kinds. The failure to distinguish them affects the specific ways in which positions on the largest issue are articulated and argued for. It's commonly assumed, for example, that if a non-cognitive committal state is not perception, it must be a belief. I think there's a lot of room between perception and belief, which is not accounted for in this literature. Okay, so that's the background. Modern discussion of primitive attribution of mental states begins with a paper by Primack and Woodruff in 1978. They wrote, "An individual has a theory of mind if he imputes mental states to himself and others. A system of inferences of this kind is properly viewed as a theory because such states are not directly observable, and the system can be used to make predictions about the behavior of others." They proposed attributing a theory of mind to chimpanzees. They cited a 14-year-old chimp's ability to anticipate behavior of a human who is confronted with such problems as acquiring an out-of-reach fruit. They showed that the apes chose from a group of photographs the one that depicted the best way to solve the problem. Primack and Woodruff took the chimpanzee's behavior to require that the chimpanzees attribute, quote, "at least two states of mind to the human actor, namely, intention or purpose on the one hand, and knowledge or belief on the other," end of quote. This conclusion was immediately criticized in commentaries on the paper. Three philosophers independently claimed that the chimpanzee might be anticipating what it itself would do to solve the problem. They felt that Primack and Woodruff's conclusion would be more convincing if the ape anticipated the agents acting in a way different from the way the ape would act. This suggestion was taken up in developmental psychology for children, not apes, some years later. Wemmer and Perner, Germans, and administered what came to be known as a false belief test. I use the term false belief test to apply to members of the family of tests inspired by Wemmer and Perner's test. Emphatically, I do not imply by my usage that the tests are good tests for false belief. Children observed here's the original test. Children observed a puppets storing a piece of chocolate and then leaving the room. Another puppet discovers the chocolate and moves it. The first puppet returns. The children are asked where that puppet will look to find the chocolate. Children younger than 4 years old do not say that the puppet will look for the chocolate where he left it. Most say that he will look where the second puppet put it. By contrast, about 60% of children in the 4 to 6 year old range say that the puppet will look where he last left it. This result and variance have been frequently replicated. The result was initially widely regarded as showing that 3-year-olds do not make genuine belief attributions, whereas 4-year-olds do. Some years later, however, Onishi and Balargian produced a variant of the original false belief test. 15-month-olds passed this variant. The test was ingeniously devised to circumvent children's having to answer questions. They were allowed to operate spontaneously. Subjects were habituated to an actor's hiding an object in one of 2 boxes and then retrieving the object. In the crucial condition, the actor put the object in one of the boxes. Then the subjects were shown the actor as being put behind a screen. The screen clearly blocked the actor's vision of the objects, of the boxes. The subjects then saw the object move to the other box. Subsequently, the screen was removed and the actor looked into one of the boxes. The subjects looked reliably, so the children looked reliably longer when the actor looked into the box that contained the object than when the actor looked into the box in which the actor had originally placed the object. The authors maintain that this result showed that, quote, even young children appeal to others' mental states, goals, perceptions, and beliefs to make sense of their actions, and a run of work in the same vein followed. The false belief test, in my view, was misnamed from the beginning. Neither the original test carried out by Wimmer and Perner, nor the subsequent tests conducted by Nishi and Balargian in themselves show anything at all about belief. Belief is a propositional attitude. To be relevant to belief, the test would have to show that the structure of the relevant states is propositional, the states that were being attributed. None of the tests in themselves bears on this issue. The fact that children can anticipate where an individual will look, even when the individual will not look where the children themselves would look, does not in itself say anything about whether the children attribute the specific attitude belief. Other mental states might produce the same behavior. But the situation is worse than this point suggests. The tests not only show nothing about attribution of the propositional attitude belief, in themselves they do not show that the children attribute psychological states of any kind. All the experiments bear on subjects assessing whether an action in a given circumstance will fulfill its function. All hinge on what sensory-based states the agent is acting on, and whether such states are geared to yield successful agency. But neither sensory access nor agency imply mentality. Ticks crawl and suck. Rotifers swim, eat, and jump. There is no reason to think that such very simple animals have mental states. Their actions are goal-oriented. Their actions have targets. Their actions are guided by sensory states or retentions of sensory states. But these organisms do not set or represent the target, nor do sensory states constitute mentality. Rotifers or ticks or paramecia sense chemicals and light. Ticks sense heat. By sensing heat, ticks sense arms that can be worth penetrating. These facts do not support attribution of mental states. Of course, children track actors' capabilities that are richer than those of a tick. I'm going to discuss such complexities later. In retrospect, a few scientists who made use of the false belief tests have acknowledged that the tests by themselves do not support taking children to attribute mental states. They appeal to the variety and accumulation of experiments to support their views. These appeals are vague. The variety of experimental arguments that have been made for taking very young children under 2 years old to attribute mental states are all variants of the false belief tests. One needs to understand in detail how and whether the variety rules out alternative systematic explanations of these very young children's behavior, and I will return to this issue. Among those who have taken false belief tests to have force in showing that children attribute false beliefs or other mental states, there remains a serious divide. The divide is between those who hold that children show this capacity only after age 3, and those who hold that children show it early in their second year, say it's now down to 13 months, I think. This divide is often associated with a dispute as to whether the capacity to attribute mental states is a late emerging innate capacity or a largely learned capacity. A range of capacities certainly do seem to emerge around the age of 4 in human children. These capacities provide some reason to think that rudimentary mentalistic attributions do occur at around this age. For example, children in the range of 4 to 6 years old attribute mental states in their use of language. They give coherent verbal explanations of relevant behavior that appeal to mental terms. Their explanations cite perceptions, beliefs, and desires. Their explanations follow patterns that broadly resemble explanations by adults. Children's prediction of behavior are similar. 4-year-olds are good at simple explanations of the sources of their belief, from perception, from being told, from figuring something out. 4-year-olds distinguish between sources that guess answers correctly and sources that know the answers. 4-year-olds rely on the latter more than on the former for information. There seems to be a change in children's abilities to distinguish symbols from reality at a bit under the age of 4. Children use contrastives in their language to mark discrepancies between an individual's state and reality. To express an understanding that others deceive and change their minds, or they seem to. Although the exact time in which these changes occur seem to vary, there's a broad change in performance in these respects at roughly these age periods. Now, even in these age periods, I think there are delicate questions about to what extent do the children understand the language they're using. It's not always obvious that want or desire mean want or desire in these very young children's language. I'm going to lay this aside for now. We can discuss it if you like. Okay, so there, those who hold that the capacity to attribute false belief emerges after age 3 cite such evidence. Those who believe that the capacity emerges at around 15 months hold that the capacities evinced in these experiments are present at a younger age but are masked by requirements of the experiments. I'm going to take no position on the details of relevant development between ages 1 and 4. I will not discuss what is innate and what is learned. Rather, I want to explain why taking the experiments with children in their 2nd year, at the very young age, to show that they engage in attribution of false belief, or indeed attribution of any mental state, is not well-founded. The difficulties that I will cite are largely shared between proponents of an early emergence of mentalistic attribution and proponents of a later emergence. And for this reason, I think it's not completely clear where mental attribution does emerge even after, say, the age of 3 or 4. All false belief tests evince the capacity on the part of infants to decouple their point of view on the world and how to act on it from an expectation of how the agent whose actions they anticipate will act on the world. This is certainly a large developmental step. Infants at 13-month-olds take it. They show a decoupling that represents others as acting differently from the way they would act and as having states that provide different information. Slightly older infants represent other agents as having different action targets from their own. This capacity constitutes another sort of decoupling. At about 14 months, children tend to offer an experimenter food that the infant prefers. But at 18 months, children offer food that the experimenter expresses preference for, even when the infant does not prefer the food. 4-year-olds make various decoupling advances again. I think that 3-year-olds do fail to pass false belief tests because of the difficulties of combining this decoupling with responding to linguistic demands in the latter tests. 4-year-olds manage to decouple while meeting these linguistic demands. The initial decouplings in the 2nd year of life are to be contrasted with capacities already in place to anticipate agents' actions. Say at 6 months old, and probably even a bit younger, human children can identify agency and targets of action. They can anticipate an efficient means of reaching these targets, and they're surprised when an agent takes an inefficient route to a target. They can form different anticipations as to how an agent will act, depending on whether that agent has sensory access to information relevant to the action. These are capacities present in apes. These earlier capacities in 6-month-olds are themselves commonly taken to evince mentalistic attributions. The attributions, however, are commonly taken to include not attributions of belief, but only attributions of desire, perception, knowledge, and ignorance. I question these construals in ways that will come up later. Even at this earlier stage, 6 to 7 month olds can take a lack of sensory access to prevent an agent from reaching the agent's target. The child can take the agent's lack of sensory access to lead to action that differs from what the child would do, given that the child has sensory access. In these respects, I'll say that the child or ape who can do similar things construes the agent's action in ways that involve cordoning off the child's own actional states from the actions of another agent. The agent is expected to do something different from what the child would do if it had the same goal or target. So both before and during what I'm calling decoupling, even very early on, children cordon off the agent's information and actional anticipations from its own. What differentiates decoupling from cordoning off? So decoupling, I'm saying, occurs at about 13 months, and cordoning off occurs at about 6 months, maybe earlier. What differentiates decoupling from cordoning off is anticipation of specific actions on the basis of states of the other agent that differ from the child's. In attributing mere lack of sensory access, the child or ape can expect the agent not to do certain things. Similarly, when it sees an obstacle between a rival's line of sight and some food, it can anticipate that the rival will not head for the food. After decoupling, however, a child can anticipate specific actions that will fail to reach their goal because of relatively specific informational states that differ from the child's. In neither cordoning off nor decoupling, in my view, is there evidence that specifically mental states are attributed. Now, there's been resistance to using false belief tests to support taking children to attribute false beliefs in their second year. So Perner, one of the authors of the original false belief test, has maintained that at the early stage, at 15 months, the test can be explained by attributing to the children a battery of learned behavioral rules. He claimed that the children anticipate that the action will go to the empty box, for example, because the actor and the object in the box were together when last seen. There are, however, many other experiments that purport to evince false belief to which this particular rule does not apply. Of course, it is possible to propose a new behavioral rule for each experiment. Unless the behavioral rules can be delimited and shown to follow some principle, like learned association, for example, this approach will lack explanatory power and fruitfulness in engendering new experiments and predictions. There does seem to be a unity to the decoupling phenomena that goes beyond learned behavioral association. They have to do with anticipating specific goal-oriented actions by agents using a representational apparatus that identifies a target and that takes account of norms of efficiency, of sensory information and access to information, and so on. It is known that children have this apparatus in their first year of life, indeed by about 6 months old. One would need good reason to maintain that they are not using it in responding to false belief tests. On the score of theoretical power and promise, the behavioral rule approach seems to be at a disadvantage. Another source of resistance proposes to explain the relevant cases in terms of very low-level perceptual associations, color, shape, and motion, together with claims that certain discontinuities in the experiments cause children to forget what they just see. This approach requires so far unsubstantiated claims that young children fail to use the action attribution representational apparatus they're known to have. It also postulates so far unconfirmed memory failures. I doubt that this approach will suffice to explain the phenomenon. As I've indicated, it's important to distinguish representations of agency that do and do not take actions to be guided by psychological states. There's still a very widespread tendency in developmental psychology and primatology, indeed in action theory within philosophy, to assume that if an event is represented as being an act by an agent, the event is represented as caused by psychological states, such as intentions, beliefs, or perceptions. Intentions are states that represent the targets of an agent's action. As noted, much in the animal world is not, much action in the animal world is not caused by intentions or any other psychological state. One cannot assume that representation of agency involves representation of psychological states. There are those who have emphasized a distinction between teleological action attributions and attributions of psychological sources of action. Unfortunately, the most serious and influential attempt to draw and apply the distinction has helped to lead the field of developmental psychology to misconstrue the distinction and underestimate its power. So Gergely and Sibra presented an account that distinguished attribution of agency with and without attributing psychological states that represent goals. They took the contrast to mark a distinction in developmental stages in very young children. First, in their account, the explanatory ground referred to in teleological explanation is the target of the action. The explanatory ground occurs later in time than the element to be explained, the action. They point out that this feature contrasts with causal and mentalistic explanations. Second, teleological attributions, on their view, refer to only three conditions. They refer A, to the behavior that is taken to be an act, B, to a future state of reality that is a target or goal, perhaps including a target object or theme, in relation to which the action is anticipated to be efficient. And third, to those aspects of reality that form conditions for taking the behavior to be an efficient means to bring about the mental state. There's no room in this teleological account for attributing an antecedent state of the agent, again contrasting with psychological attributions. Third, Gergely and Sibra take teleological explanations to be, quote, reality-based, unquote. The explanations must represent the world as the explainer represents it. The explainer can observe and infer actions and action targets that differ from the explainer's own. The explainer can observe that an action can fail to meet its target. The failure can be represented as resulting from lack of sensory access to an aspect of the environment. These are all relations between agent and environment. Since there's no room in the explanations for attributing states of the agent, there's no room for representing states of the agent that are out of sync with reality as the explainer represents it. None of these three features is necessary to attributions of agency that do not attribute psychological sources to the agent. First, such attribution of agency can be causal. Second, it can attribute states of the agent, non-psychological action states and sensory states. And third, it need not be reality-based. It is open to the explainer to represent non-psychological action sets that are out of sync with reality. The one restriction on such attributions, which I'll discuss in more detail later, is that they do not represent the relevant action sets or sensory set of states as psychological. Gergely and Sibra postulate a transformation in child development from teleological explanation to causal mentalistic explanation. They see the teleological form of explanation as breaking down when someone acts on false beliefs or pretense. They mean that that form of explanation cannot account for children's attributional responses in false belief tests or for their responses in pretense or pretend play. But non-psychological action attribution can attribute antecedent states that are out of sync with attributor's representation of reality, as long as those attributed states are non-psychological That is, as long as the states are not strictly false or otherwise non-veridical. Passing the false belief test does not in itself show that children have shifted from non-psychological action attributions to attributions of psychological states that cause action. More recently, Perner and Rössler postulate for very young children an action attribution scheme that avoids any attribution of sensory or cognitive states and relates agents to what they call reasons that consist in non-representational states of affairs in the world. The overly rationalistic invocation of reason instead of efficiency, the avoidance of taking children to attribute state instances in causal explanation, requiring a very specific conception of causation, and the assumption that the scheme breaks down when agency attributor and agent are not in cooperative relation all seem to be drawbacks of this more recent model. In the latter respect, their model shares the deficiency of the Sibra model of action attribution. This new model is congenial, with my view, in taking very young children to be mainly action attributors, not attributors of representational cognitive states. But the article falls into confusion in taking purposive action to entail that the agent has a psychological state of intention, though to be sure, on their view, not a propositional representational reason or propositional representational intention. They take their under-specified notion of intention to be, quote, a psychological state in good standing. Although the model does not take very young children to attribute representational psychological states, it does postulate purely relational psychological states. In my view, there are no such states. And there's no reason to think that children make the error of attributing such states. Many developmental psychologists and primatologists have been less strict than Burge and Sibra in distinguishing action attribution that is not accompanied by psychological attribution from action attribution that is. Many reject their non-causal model for action attribution by very young children. Many hold that children attribute intention and desire before they pass the false belief test. I'm going to criticize these ideas in a fuller version of this paper. Despite these controversies, Burge and Sibra's claim that non-mentalistic action attribution cannot account for children's passing the false belief test is widely accepted. The idea is that if a child attributes an informational state whose relation to the environment differs from the child's own psychological representational states, that informational state must itself be a psychological state. Indeed, it is widely assumed that the relevant states are false beliefs because they're commonly standing states, not current perceptions. I've indicated some informational states are out of sync with reality, but are not states that are psychological or representational. What distinction am I relying on? The fields of developmental psychology and primatology have been handicapped by a nearly universal failure to distinguish sensing from perceiving. Sensing is an information registration relation between an organism and the environment. That is, it functions to vary statistically with environmental conditions that are statistically likely to cause it. Sensory states are information registration states that guide action or other behavior. Sensory states are not in themselves distinctively mental or psychological. As I said earlier, rotiferous ticks, caterpillars, sense features of the environment. They have no mental or psychological capacities, as far as we know. In representing sensory informational states of agents, very young children and apes are not thereby representing anything mental or psychological. In the absence of specific evidence that very young children and apes represent and attribute perception, perceptual memory, belief, or other representational states that is distinctively psychological, It is appropriate to credit them only with representation of attribution of sensory states and sensory relations. A child or ape can represent an agent as being in sensory contact with food, with a capacity to retain the effect of that contact and to track the food by sensory means. The child or ape may be perceptually attuned to relations between agent and sense object. Some of these relations allow the agent to track the object. Others do not allow such tracking. The child need not represent the agent as perceiving or perceptually representing the food. There are many ways to track an object sensorily without perceiving it. Since perception is a special case of sensing, and since there's no specific evidence that children attribute special features that differentiate perception from sensing, it is appropriate to take them to be attributing the generic capacity rather than the specific capacity. One might think that sensory states are, quote, reality-based and thus cannot be what are attributed when very young children pass the false belief tests. This thought is confused. Non-psychological sensory states can be out of sync with reality in various action-relevant ways. In fact, this point underlies quite a lot of work on the sensory systems of animals. Take, for example, research on circadian body clocks. Very simple organisms that lack psychological states show circadian rhythms in their activity. These rhythms are kept in sync with the day-night cycle by sensory entrainment mechanisms, for example, by exposure to a change from light to dark every morning. I should say every evening. But the organism is kept in a constantly lit, if the organism is kept in a constantly lit environment, it will commonly continue to act on the rhythm of the day-night cycle for a while. Since such rhythms are never perfectly in sync with the environment, they go out of phase if they are not entrained with exposure to the change from dark to light or light to dark. So if the organism is not thus entrained, it will operate on outdated sensory information that may lead it to act in ways that will not reach its targets. The explanations need not and do not postulate psychological states with veridicality conditions. Consider another example closer to the decoupling. Consider another example closer to the decoupling involved in a false belief test. Suppose that a tick senses the heat of a human arm and begins crawling toward it. Suppose that the tick's progress is arrested but not displaced, and the arm is moved elsewhere. The arm is placed in a position where the tick cannot sense its warmth. Suppose that the tick's sensory condition is unaffected. Perhaps its sensors are artificially heated, or perhaps it's so constituted that it continues to move a predetermined distance to reach its target, given that it received the sensory stimulation. The tick is then allowed to crawl again after the arm has been moved. We would expect the tick to continue crawling toward the position where the arm had been, rather than toward the new position of the arm. Such expectation need not attribute an inaccurate perceptual memory or a false belief or any other representational psychological state. The tick's action does not reach its target because the tick's sensory states and their retentions are out of sync with the action-relevant target object, the arm or food source. However, the tick's cognitive and sensory states are not psychological states with veridicality conditions. Attribution of non-psychological sensory states does not require taking those states to be in sync with reality in action-relevant ways. By understanding an agent's sensory states are out of sync with reality, one can predict very specifically how it will fail to reach the action's target. In false belief tests, when 13, 15-month-old children see the actor hiding and retrieving an object in a box, They attribute the acts of placing the object inside the box and retrieving it. They also attribute a visual or light-based sensory state that senses the object in the box. When the actor is screened from the scene, the children attribute retention of this sensory state. The subjects see the object move to the other box and decouple this perception from attribution of the retained sensory state of the actor. The actor's retained sensory state tracked the object in the first box. When the actor returns and looks in a box, the child attributes the goal-oriented act and retrieval. Given that the child anticipates the action will be guided by the sensory state, the child anticipates the actor will look in the first box, even though the child has a perceptual memory of its being in the second box. The child's behavior depends on attributing actions, sensory states, retention of sensory states, and perhaps cognitive states that cause the actions. But these attributions are not themselves attributions of mental or psychological states, much less false beliefs. The child expects the actor to be misled, but the attributional apparatus is the same general apparatus that we use in anticipating agential behavior of a tick in parallel circumstances, except that the child is unspecific about, the child doesn't think it's not representational. It's just unspecific as whether it's representational or not. Rather, whether it's representational doesn't come up for the child. Whereas for adults, we're inclined to say the tick lacks mentality. But to think that the tick lacks mentality, one has to have the concept of mentality. And I'm not sure whether the child has, or at least whether the child is using any concept of mentality. It's already known that by 6 months of age, human children and apes, or at least mature apes, distinguish action from movement and associate targets and norms of efficiency with action. The false belief tests show that in their second year, human children can decouple expectations of specific action sets, actions, and targets by another being from the child's own. The child enriches the simple action explanation scheme through considerable experience of other beings' actional targets and actional tendencies. But no evidence has been adduced to show that at this stage the child departs from the basic action attribution scheme that we know it already has. The idea that the child is mind reading or has a theory of mind or is otherwise attributing psychological states to the actor is a gross hyper-intellectualization as far as the current evidence goes. The vaunted variety of false belief tests that have been carried out to date, to my knowledge, submit to the same methods of explanation. I'm just going to discuss a sampling of such tests. Young children have been shown to pass false belief tests when doing so hinges on tracking an identified individual. Non-psychological sensory states can be taken to track individuals in a given context. In attributing sensing of individuals, children can take retained sensory states and goal-oriented actions in others to track individuals. Young children pass false belief tests when doing so hinges on connecting agencies to properties or parts of a sought object rather than the object itself. For example, young children are familiarized with an agent's reaching for a doll with blue hair and reaching away from a toy skunk. Before a test trial, subjects saw the doll put in a plain box and the skunk put in a box with a tuft of blue hair attached to the box. In the present condition, the actor was present when this placement was carried out. In the absent condition, the actor is absent. In the test trial, subjects saw the actor reach for the plate box or for the box with the blue hair attached. In the condition in which the actor was absent during the doll skunk placement, subjects looked longer if the actor opened the plain box, seeming to anticipate that the actor would follow the clue of the blue hair. In the condition in which the actor was present during the doll skunk placement, the infants looked longer if the actor opened the box with the blue hair attached, given that the skunk was there and the actor had been exposed to its being put there. The statistical covariation relation between a sensory state and its retention and the environment holds between any given sensory state and properties that covary with it. The child can package any number of salient environmental properties that covary with the action's target and can take the agent to be capable of sensorily tracking the target by any of these properties. The child anticipates the agent's tracking the doll by tracking the blue hair. Thus, the child anticipates that the actor will open the box with the blue hair attached, even though the doll is in the plain box. The child's attribution of sensing is not specifically a psychological attribution. Another variant on the false belief paradigm tested whether 18-month-old infants anticipated sensory states that mislead agents can be related to non-obvious properties. So in an agent's presence, an experimenter showed that a box rattled when shaken because of marbles inside. The subjects had been shown that the agent took rattling the box as a target action. In the test phase, the agent picked one of two test objects. One was type identical to the experimenter's object, the other differed in color and pattern. The subjects, but not the agent, were previously shown that the different test objects rattled when shaken, but the type identical test object did not. Subjects looked longer when the agent picked the different test object, thus succeeding in carrying out the target action to find something to rattle, and when the agent picked the type identical test object, thereby failing to carry out the target action. The authors interpreted the results as showing false belief reasoning extends to false beliefs about non-obvious properties of objects, and does so when search is not an issue. This experiment brings out that infants can chain directly sense properties, the properties of the object that contain the marbles, to dispositional properties. The infants also anticipate that an agent will engage in similar chaining. They attribute a capacity to anticipate rattling from an object that is disposed to rattle when marbles are placed inside. They recognize that such anticipation can mislead if conditions change. Again, the experiment provides no insight into how the infants construed the agent's mechanism of chaining. 18-month-olds were shown to be able to help an actor go to the box containing a target object after the object had been switched when the actor was out of the room. This case differed from others that I've described in that the subjects engaged in active behavior to help another agent reach a target when the subjects had information that the agent lacked. I think it clear that this case presents no new difficulties for an account that takes the child to attribute agency, action, target, sensing, and retention of sensing. In an ingenious series of experiments, 15-month-olds were shown to anticipate an agent's states being out of sync with action sequences that involve pretense. In a single trial, 15-month-olds were shown 2 empty cups. An actor then pretended to pour liquid into one of them. The actor then pretended to drink either from the cup into which she had pretended to pour or from the other cup. Subjects looked longer when the actor pretended to drink from the cup into which she had not pretended to pour liquid into. A further experiment was carried out with pretended pourings into one of 2 shoes, and also into one of 2 tubes that had no bottom. If the infant were familiarized with pretend drinking from these unusual receptacles, the infant anticipated drinking behavior from the receptacle into which the actor pretended to pour. These experiments do not present false belief tests. They test young children's ability to anticipate agents following means-end sequences, even when the agency involves play. It fails to include elements, such as liquid or receptacle with a bottom, that would be necessary to carry out real counterparts of the played actions. The authors of this experiment take response to active play to be, quote, a hallmark of mentalistic understanding. I think that this claim has no force. The experiments do show that infants are capable of playing along, recognizing that a play action does not involve all real components of its counterpart. The child can catch on to play action through relatively simple transformations on familiar non-play action sequences. The child knows a lot about drinking and pouring. A drinking motion without anything to drink is easily construed as play drinking. The cognitive and informational states that lie behind such play need not be specified by the child. The child's capacity to anticipate means in action sequences within play can involve considerable flexibility and ingenuity. The capacity involves a decoupling between the child's normal representation of reality and its representation of action and informational states of a play partner. This decoupling constitutes an important developmental step, but at this young stage, no evidence has been provided that supports taking human children to attribute specifically psychological states or mechanisms to the play partner. At the outset, I noted that modern discussion of the origin of attribution of mental states stem from primatology, study of apes, not child development. Apes had not been shown to pass false belief tests. So some of the issues just discussed do not arise for apes. The conflation of sensing and perception is, however, firmly lodged in the primatological literature. This conflation, together with a tendency to regard all action as intention-based, reproduces in primatology several of the same confusions that beset the child development literature. Because of limitations of time and space, I will not separately discuss these confusions here. The fact that action expectations require an infant to observe how an agent operates in a complex situation that extends over time has motivated taking infants to attribute various kinds of psychological states, in particular perception, inference, memory, belief, and knowledge. There's been little serious thought about distinguishing these kinds in a serious scientific way. Let me go through this list very briefly. Attribution of sensing, unspecific as to whether the sensing is perception, is more fitted to the data than attribution of perception. The term inference is widely used in misleading ways to include any transformation of information in an organism. In fact, however, some transformations involve distinctively psychological representational states and others do not. Unless there is evidence that the transformations involve psychological states, one should not allow the term inference to connote a specifically psychological transformation, much less a propositional inference. The term belief is commonly invoked to cover any standing non-cognitive informational state other than a perception or other sensory state. Beliefs are a specific type of standing representational state, a propositional attitude. Non-cognitive representational states other than beliefs that help cause action are perceptual memories, perceptual anticipations, amodal, non-propositional states, and so on. There are also standing non-cognitive, non-representational informational states that help cause action. The term memory is commonly applied to any sort of retention of information. Some retentions of information are representational psychological states. Other retentions of information do not represent anything. They simply retain informational registrations. For example, muscle memory and retentions of non-representational sensory information are examples. Retentions of sensory information in standing states are part of the repertoire of all animals. Similar points apply to common uses of the term knowledge in this literature. Genuine attributions of knowledge occur only when the attributor attributes psychological states. Ticks and rotifers lack knowledge because they lack psychologies. A cursory reading of the literature that I've been citing will bring out numerous instances of careless use of the terms perception, inference, desire, intention, memory, belief, and knowledge. Such uses, in effect, hyper-intellectualize what the evidence shows very young infants and apes' attributional capacities to be. The hyper-intellectualization hinges on not thinking carefully about the nature of psychological attribution and on blurring distinctions that are basic to a scientific understanding of the mind. I want to shift gears and raise one other topic before I quit. This will be brief. I've illustrated non-psychological action explanations by reference to our adult explanations of the actions of very simple animals. Non-psychological action explanations need not be confined to the agency of such animals. Much more complex behavior than that of ticks and rotivores can be understood using this scheme. Capacities to represent a large variety of acts on targets probably begins with representation of acts that are basic to the species: eating, navigating, mating, grooming, nursing, returning home, picking up entities, pushing entities, and so on. Since children and apes are fast learners, this base of natural acts can be amplified immensely and quickly through observation, given natural capacities to connect actions with their targets and target objects. There remains a type of low-level attribution whose discussion in psychology does not follow the lines that I've discussed. I have in mind attributions of relatively primitive emotions and attributions of conscious sensations. First, the emotions. Infants visually distinguish faces from other entities and distinguish facial expressions for types of certain types of emotion, such as fear and joy. Despite occasional claims to the contrary, no one literally perceives others' emotions as distinguished from expressions that are cues to emotion. Representing a facial expression that is commonly caused by an emotion, say anger, and is a good basis for reacting in ways that are functionally appropriate to anger, does not in itself constitute representing as anger the cause of the facial expression. Again, functional covariation and reliable tracking do not suffice for having attributives for the relevant mental states. Most, but not all, researchers on emotion have been clear about this point. Can very young children parlay their perception of emotion expression into representations of such emotions as fear, anger, and joy as such, as those emotions? Children and animals are adept at connecting emotion expression with functional, in particular actual, consequences of such expression. Children quickly learn to use their perceptions of anger expression to anticipate actions to be avoided or feared. Of course, such capacities have very early evolutionary roots in the animal kingdom. Agitation and tensed body poses constitute threat displays. What would it take to represent the causes of emotion expressions as specific emotions? It seems plausible that to represent an emotion, one would have to represent it as a cause of the expressions that one perceives. There is evidence that very young children attribute causal relations among perceived entities between their own states and their own actions, and between unperceived physical events and perceived events. The question then reduces to whether children can represent such causes as emotions, as psychological states. This is analogous to the question of whether children represent cognitive states as psychological states. Many emotions are representational. Fear of dogs is commonly associated with perception and memory of dogs. As already indicated, no good evidence for capacity in very young children or apes to represent perception or representational memory has been presented. Connecting action-causing states with sensing of functional targets seems to suffice to explain such animal and very early child responses to emotion expressions. Emotions commonly have sensation-like elements. A feeling of fear is often associated with a phenomenal visceral sensation. Finally, emotions commonly, perhaps always, have functional aspects. A function of fear is to cause avoidance or protective behavior. Most emotions in human adult life have all three aspects: representational, phenomenal, and functional. But it seems plausible that certain very primitive emotions lack a representational aspect. For example, an olfactory state may by itself functionally guide a type of fear, even though the olfactory state is not perceptual. So perhaps one can represent something as a relatively primitive emotion without representing it as a representational state. To do so, one must represent the state's connection to guiding sensory states and to functional upshots. However, although there are certainly unconscious emotions, I doubt that any individual can represent an emotion as such unless the individual is capable of representing conscious states. The most primitive emotions seem to involve some aspect of phenomenally conscious feeling, as well as relevant functional relations. So I think that the question of whether very young children can attribute non-representational emotions may hinge on whether very young children can attribute conscious sensory states. I believe that there is a serious possibility that they can. Again, although there have been occasional claims that one can literally perceive or feel others' pains, I'm going to ignore such claims. The question is whether very young children can use pain expression as a basis for representing another's pain as such. Since pain is not in itself a representational state, representing it is not representing a representational state. One can represent it by imagining it. The phenomenon of contagious pain seems to involve low-level enough psychological capacities to expect that very young children may be capable of having it. Contagious pain is illustrated by the vicarious feeling one has in wincing after observing another's behavior resulting from a sharp pain. Plausibly, such feeling is a type of imagination. Experimentally, very young children appear to have such vicarious feelings. Since the vicarious feelings are guided by representations, it's possible, even plausible, that in having such feelings, they represent pains in others. Thus, it seems plausible that very young children represent in others pains and perhaps emotions that have sensory components. They feel their own pains. They would have to retain some marker of that feel in its absence through memory or imagination. And they would have to represent that feel in another individual. There is evidence that they have some simulation mirroring resources that may underlie such simple sensory memory and sensory imagination. To my knowledge, there is as yet no strong evidence that these resources are best accounted for in the relevant psychological terms. But the distance between what one is now known on the one hand about taking apes and very young children to make attributions of sensation and elementary emotions to others seems smaller than the distance that separates current evidence from postulation of attributions by very young children and apes of representational mental states. Insofar as apes and very young children attribute mental states, they may attribute simple sensations and conscious emotions closely associated with feeling. Last paragraph. The lack of substance in the hoopla that has surrounded taking apes and very young children to attribute mental states is a cautionary tale for the very young sciences of primatology and developmental psychology. The terms theory of mind and mind reading have often been used in a spirit of salesmanship, not scientific disinterest. The terms systematically mislead. There is currently no evidence that supports taking apes and very young children to theorize about mind. There's no evidence that they read anything mental. There's no evidence that they attribute states with representational content and associate them with signs or behavior, a necessary feature of any natural application of the term mind reading. Meta-representational capacities may emerge very early, but so far there's no good reason to think that they do. Significantly, the earliest constructions in language do not feature representations of psychological states. They center obsessively on action. Thank you.
So, start with a session of questions. Is there any question? Salma, please.
Yes. I would like to know whether you accept that you can have perceptual representational states that are unspecific. Because with your assumptions that you have a certain kind of content, like a propositional attitude, it seems to me that perhaps you're assuming that it has to be very specific. And that was one of the reasons for denying that young children might have perceptual states.
No, the young children have perceptual states. I think they probably even have beliefs. What I'm doubting is whether they attribute psychological states or beliefs to others. So the answer to
they
the
wouldn't be attributing them to themselves either.
That's right. I don't think they attribute psychological states either to themselves or to others. I think it's likely that they attribute them to others before they attribute them to themselves. So I don't think there's any such thing as a perceptual representational state that is itself unspecific. My idea is that the children are thinking and attributing unspecific actional states to others. And it's unspecific as to, is it mental or not? The child doesn't have this distinction, I'm imagining. It doesn't have the distinction between mental and non-mental because they don't they're not using the concept of mental. So their attribution is just action, target, efficient, not efficient, sensory access to the target, stuff like that. I take the children to have, certainly by the time they're 12 months old, by the time they're 1 year old, they certainly have beliefs. I don't think we know whether apes have beliefs, but they certainly have perceptual states. And the apes have psychologies. They've got representational psychologies. What I'm doubting is whether either apes or children attribute psychologies to other beings or to themselves. Have I responded to the?
Yeah, sorry.
I wonder why to tie the notion of belief to propositional attitudes. Many people have, let's say, contested that assumption. If an organism acts as if it believes something, when we talk about pragmatic sense of belief that is very convenient, scientists use. And also I asked what do you mean by saying that the child must have a concept of mentality? It sounds very heavy when you say mentality and abstract.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Nobody has
if they have any specific representation of any mental state as that kind of specific mental state, that's enough. That's what I mean by having a concept of mentality. So certainly not some general notion, right? Let me come back to the first point. It's pragmatically useful, of course, to attribute beliefs to all kinds of things. So it's convenient to attribute beliefs to the tick, right? It's okay to do that in colloquial usage. We're trying to do a science of what is actually going on here. And I don't really care so much about the term belief. I do think there's an important distinction between propositional states and non-propositional states. I do associate my notion of belief with the propositional state, but I don't really care about that. What's important is distinguishing the propositional attributions from attributions of non-propositional representational states, and distinguishing both of those from attributions of sensory states or actional states that are not mental or representational or psychological at all.
You hold that mind begins with arthropods. It's
mind. Again, mind is a ordinary term, but yes. I'm assuming there are two serious marks of psychology or mind. One is consciousness, one is representation. Right? I think we know that certain arthropods have representation. That is, they've got real perception as opposed to just sensory capacities. So they have psychologies. If you're nervous about saying they have minds, I'm okay with that. I tend to associate mind with consciousness more, and psychology with representation, right? But these are subtleties that, linguistic subtleties that I think don't really matter very much. What we have these two categories, consciousness, representation. They are very useful. I want to find where either one of them applies in the sort of animal kingdom. And I think we do know that representation in a serious psychological sense applies at the level of arthropods. They do have perception. They have perception, of course they don't attribute perception to anything, but they have perception. That's enough for me to say they have perception. Perceptual psychology applies to them. So you could say psychology begins with the arthropods. If you want to reserve the term mind for consciousness, I don't think we know where consciousness begins. I don't think we know whether arthropods are conscious. So I think that's an open question.
Excellent.
Thank you. I can see how sensing is more primitive than perceiving, but you seem to infer from that therefore attributing sensing is more simple than attributing perceiving.
Yes.
However, I am skeptical
Yes.
of this inference for two reasons. The first reason is because it's well known that we have a intrinsicalist bias. There's ample empirical evidence for this, and that means that we tend to explain behavior in terms of internal stuff, and that seems to favor not the purely behavioral explanation.
I'm not giving a purely behavioral explanation. I'm assuming that the sensory state is an internal
It's
state.
internal state.
Yes.
Okay.
So on that point, we're on the same side.
Okay,
right?
exactly. We got it. My worry is about why favor the sense among the internal. Once you have to give an internal why
Right.
with the child,
Right.
have first the sensory
Right.
and the perceptual, especially if they themselves have a very rich perceptual life and not, and well, at least
Right.
from the
Yeah.
adult perspective, we are not that aware of our sensorial lives. It seems that the perceptual aspect of our mental life is more salient. So it would be odd that we would start attributing sensing before we start attributing perception.
Well, perception is a form of sensing. So
Okay, well,
in being, in having conscious perceptions, they're having conscious sensings. So they have just as much access to the one to the other. And of course, I think they do have perception, but the issue is, can they attribute perception? Can they get into the meta position of representing perception? That's the pointed issue. So I take it that science is committed to Morgan's canon. Morgan's canon says, don't attribute a higher level mental capacity when the attribution of a lower level mental capacity will explain the behavior equally well. I think that this canon is necessary to placing reasonable restrictions on the science. And I think that science does follow Morgan's canon. You might say, somebody might say, well, you should just take the children and apes to be attributing everything we're attributing. But I think that's exactly what we need to understand how this development occurs, if there's a development. And we can't put any we can't do that if we just are entirely liberal about this. We need specific evidence for finding attribution of specific states. Otherwise, we should take the states that are being attributed to be more generic.
But this knife goes both ways, because also your way that you will also have to give a sentence that it is the specific non-psychological state, the one that that the children are attributing or the age.
No, I don't think they're attributing a specific non-psychological state as a non-psychological state. To attribute something as a non-psychological state, they'd have to have the concept of psychological, right? So the idea is they're attributing a state that applies to action, applies to sensing, and it just doesn't bring in either mentality or non-mentality, or psychological or non-psychological. That whole issue hasn't been shown to arise yet for the children. That's a picture.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. This kind of issue comes up, and I need to address it more in the paper that I do. It's come up in every discussion question that I, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think I'm very skeptical of your arguments. I take it that more than giving a positive account of what goes on with little kids, you're just trying to go against the accepted view. And
Well, I think I gave a positive account.
so I have problems with the positive account. So there are points where I fail to follow your argument because, for example, one of your claims is that there's a distinction between very basic sensing and perception, and then you give examples of non-human animals where they're sensing. But that's not evidence that there's a difference in humans between sensing and perceiving.
But there
I would
obviously
like to-
is.
Huh?
But there is.
Yeah, but you did not give it. You just mentioned.
It's obvious.
Well, it's not obvious to the person that you're attacking,
Okay.
because that person obviously thinks that if it's perceiving, it's representational, and when I'm attributing something like that, I'm always attributing something psychological. So I'm just presenting the reasons why I'm skeptical about that. Then other negative arguments of yours against the accepted view go something like, well, we attribute mental states to caterpillars, and that clearly is.
No, we don't.
You just said that to Alejandro, that maybe we like to say that. We like to say things
Oh, I
like
see.
the
Yeah.
whale knows how to
Yeah,
swim
sort of
and things
colloquial
like that.
talk. Yeah, sometimes we do.
But of course, doing that is not evidence that we do not attribute mental states. That's for a completely different discussion. We might be completely mistaken about which beings on Earth have mental states,
Yes.
and still clearly attribute mental states to them.
Yes.
So I don't see how that point is relevant to the claim that we're not attributing mental states. So maybe the little kid would still attribute mental states to the tick, but that would still be evidence that the little kid attributes mental states, right? Even if it's a tick, the little kid's just completely off with regards to its theory of mind. So I'm not exactly clear how your argument against the. So my first point is that I'm not sure how the negative argument is supposed to work, and the second point, sort of more directly against your view, it's your claim in the end is that we are the accepted view is over intellectualizing little kids and chimpanzees or primates, and I think, at least as far as I understood it, it seems that your opponent can say that something like your modus ponens is my modus tollens. It seems that you are over intellectualizing the idea of belief and mental state. That it's not really like that. If you're demanding something as strong as, for example, that in order for me to represent a belief, I must have the concept of belief. I must represent something as being a belief. I'm not sure if that happens before.
But did you just say in order to represent something as having a belief, you have to have the concept of belief?
It seems
You
to
don't
me that
have to have the
you're.
concept of belief.
I'm presenting your view. So according as far as I understood your view,
Yes.
you are demanding that human beings, in order to attribute belief states, they must understand what belief is. And that just seems way too demanding. It seems that it would follow that prior to philosophy of mind classes, no one ever attributed mental states. Because I doubted that human beings normally have a notion of what belief is.
Okay. Let me respond to the second thing first. I do think that in attribute belief states, as belief states, you have to have some minimal mastery of what a belief is. I mean, I think that is a priori obvious.
I doubt.
That doesn't mean, yeah, a lot of people doubt a priori obvious things. I should, all right.
But that's exactly my worry.
Okay, let me elaborate this. The word belief is used in all kinds of different ways. So these scientists themselves attribute belief to things that I think when you remind them of certain distinctions, they would be a little doubtful as to whether they should attribute belief. It's true that we use the word belief to over-attribute all the time. It's convenient. The propositional attitude, explanatoristic attribution system is a very convenient, very powerful explanatory system. I take it what we're trying to do here, including the scientists, is to get an account of what the specific capacities of the children actually are. And again, I will give away the word belief. If you want to have it, you can have it. I'm interested in whether children attribute something that everybody could recognize as psychological or not. I take it that everybody recognizes there are two main marks of the psychological, the representational and the consciousness. So can we find evidence that the child is generally attributing representational states in a distinctively psychological sense of representation? I'm not assuming that, in fact, I deeply disbelieve, I'm probably on the same side as you are on this one. I don't think that in order to attribute beliefs or propositional attitudes, you have to have a philosopher's mastery of what that is. I'm a proponent of the idea of incomplete understanding. In fact, it's one of my main themes in philosophy of mind, that a lot of the concepts that we have, we don't understand very well. And I'm very open to children having a concept of belief and attributing belief to others well before they understand it very well. But I want something in the child's behavior that is best explained in terms of something distinctive to belief, because if what the child is doing is common between belief, perception, sensing, then there's no specific reason, again by Morgan's canon, to take the child to be representing anything psychological at all. So the background view, I'm quite willing to say, I don't want to demand the child have any kind of sophisticated mastery of any of these notions. But I do want the child to have some ability that distinguishes, an ability to attribute either belief or perception or some other psychological state from attributing something that is much more general. That's the best I can do with the second point. So I'd like to plead innocent to the idea of I'm over intellectualizing, and I do agree that we don't have any recipe for a kind of criteria that says here's where mental attribution begins. I think I'm trying to encourage the scientific community to be more sophisticated in their experimental methods, to look in more detail or with more specificity at what the children's abilities actually are. I think at present the account is just way too general. See if I can get the yeah, human adults definitely have sensory capacities as well as psychological capacities. They first place, perception is a subcase of sensing. So when they have sensing, when they have perception, they have sensing. But second, there are just lots of sensory capacities, such as smell. Smell is probably not representational. Taste is probably not representational. We have those sensory capacities. We also have pretty much what the lower animals have. We have sensitivity to light that is not specifically perceptual. So I think this is a well-known fact about human beings, a scientific fact, that they've got lots of capacities other than the perceptual capacities, and they have sensory capacities. So my argument is not that the children sort of home in on non-perceptual sensory capacities. It's that they're onto the genus sense capacity, or at least particular instances of this genus, but no evidence that they've sort of narrowed down to species within that genus.
Alessandro, después vas tú. Tranquilo.
Yes. So I'm inclined to think that if I leave my phone on a desk and then I leave the room and then I come back and I pick up my phone, this action involves the representation that the phone at time t0 is identical to the phone at time t1,
yes,
where t1 is later. See?
Yes.
So if we go back to the experiments with the kids, so it seems to me that there is a representation involved in the actor leaving an object in a box, then leaving the room, coming back and looking for the objects and picking it up. So if the child attributes anything to the actor, then the child should at least be attributing this representation. And if that's the case, then he's attributing mental states.
Well, it's the next to last, it's the last premise that I doubt. In attributing anything to the actor, it has to be attributing the mental state. Take it that if the child, an alternative account, which I think is equally supported by the evidence and better supported by Morgan's canon, is that the child is representing a sensory state that tracks the object. Sensory state that tracks the object, tracks in the sense that it causally covaries with the object and functions to causally covary. That's enough to count.
Covariance if there is discontinuity. I mean, I left the room.
Yeah.
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 And
Right.
I come back. Where's the covariance?
Well, tracking involves the capacity to retain previous information. So the covariance is with the object, given that it went behind the barrier, say. So that's particular.
So you would agree that there is representation on the side of the actor, but there is no attribution of representation on the side of the kid.
Yeah, I think the kid and the actor both represent. The actor, being an adult, is certainly going to be interested in the child's psychological states. Open question: do the children represent the actor as having some kind of representational state? And I think so far there's no evidence that up until age 3 or 4 they do. Though the child, I take it the child is representing action, sensory states, sensory access, capacity to retain the previous access and keep tracking, so on. And I think the child is simply not committed as to whether the retention is representational or not, whether the sensing is perceptual or not, etc.
Yes. I understand that there is a clear difference between representing sensations or perceptual representation and psychological representation, which is which I think we were discussing with the previous comments. There's a little bit of confusion between sensory representation, perceptual representation, and psychological representation. I think a little bit I got that impression. But I think,
Can I just say this? I think that the term representation is used for all three. But when you examine what the scientists mean by representation when they apply it to the merely sensory stuff, it's not representation in any psychological sense. It's not a mark of the mental.
but
So if we're to sort of hold by that idea, we're taking the mark of psychology as representation in the distinctively psychological sense, then my view is sensation or sensing is not representational. And the other two, the perception and the belief is.
But that's the thing. I find it, as a cognitive scientist, I find it very difficult to find an experiment for which psychological representation is necessary. And it's parallel to the bridging problem of consciousness. How can you be sure that that task really requires psychological representation? You cannot be 100% sure, because you can always say that is not a psychological representation. That is always attention, working memory, perception, maybe other low-level cognitive functions, but without psychological representation. So maybe the problem goes back to the definition of mental representation, and how can you really have psychological representation? How can you measure psychological
We're
representation?
talking about as scientists about other beings, yeah. Well, I think this problem has been largely answered, not in detail. And first, I'm going to agree with you. Nothing is 100% sure. I mean, you know well enough as a scientist to know that no empirical science is ever 100% sure. So that's way too much to ask. But I think in perceptual psychology, there's emerged a methodology for explaining things in a distinctively psychological sense of representation, which is applicable when you find perceptual constancies. You don't find perceptual constancies in worms and ticks and so on. You do in higher level animals. So I'm looking at science here. I'm saying one science, perceptual psychology, has given a definite explanatory use for a distinctive notion of representation. Although the sort of broad notion of representation that applies both to psychologies and not is present in psychological science. Within perceptual psychology, detailed, rigorous explanations work off the assumption that certain states have veridicality conditions, and finding exactly what the line is between sensory registration is what I call it, and genuine representation. I don't think anybody has a sharp criterion, but I've proposed, and I think people in perceptual psychology whom I've talked to, serious scientists, think it's pretty plausible criterion or rough guide is that when you find perceptual constancies, you have the basis for explanations that do appeal to representation in this narrower sense.
Of course, the best thing we have in psychology are the verbal reports. So, for example, talking about consciousness, if someone says he's conscious, you assume he's conscious, and then you go to the lab and you measure brain activity, and you try to look what is the difference between a conscious state and a non-conscious state based on the verbal report. And we can maybe trace this to the theory of mind about psychological representation and try to track the neural activity during psychological representation. But I really find it difficult to trace it to children when they cannot give verbal reports. Yes. It's very difficult to look for psychological representation and brain activity. Yes. In that case.
Right. Well, I think the science of consciousness is way behind the science of representation. It's an important science. It's making progress. But I don't think there's anything in the theory of consciousness that's remotely as impressive as what's going on in perceptual psychology. And perceptual psychology does not rest purely on verbal reports. It takes account of all kinds of behavior to determine whether a being has a perceptual constancy. So you can find that, I mean, obviously the bees don't have any verbal reports, but there's very, very strong evidence that they've got perceptual constancies. And detailed account as how it works. Of course, the brain, what you can find out about what's going on in the brain is a further source of evidence, but it's hard to interpret. So I don't think that the brain activity stuff has been integrated as well as it will be. But you know, I'm very sympathetic with how hard this is to get solid. But I'm impressed with the fact that perceptual psychology, which is the part of psychology that's by far the most rigorous at this stage, and the most like the classical natural sciences in terms of the mathematization, the rigor, the detail, and prediction, and so on. I think there's a lot of evidence that mentalistic explanations in science are going to work. And I see perceptual psychology sort of leading the charge, but I fully expect higher level cognitive psychology to go along. And maybe in 50 years or 100 years, we'll have a science of consciousness that will be comparable.
Fernando?
Are you okay? I have so my first point, well, it's not much of a point, I think it's just like a subtle objection, perhaps. But I was thinking in the experiment with the boxes, it seems right to say that the children see that there's someone in front of them, and they also see that there's boxes in front of them.
Yeah.
It also seems right to say that they see that the actors see that there's boxes in front of them. And then
It seems right, but that's what's at issue.
well,
They sense boxes in front of them.
so they don't see that the actors see that there's boxes in front of them. Doesn't that just sound strange though? I mean,
Well, look, I think see that is a term that won't survive in science. It's a hybrid.
yeah,
Seeing is a non-propositional state.
sure. This is seeing that.
And seeing that is a propositional state. So I think seeing that is a hybrid between something about belief and seeing. And I'm willing to, since I think these children have belief and have vision, perception, visual perception, I'm okay with saying they see that X and see that Y. I don't think it's mistaken. I just don't think it's gonna survive in the science. It's not specific enough as to what they're actually doing. What they're doing is a combination of having a visual perception of something and forming a belief. So I don't, what's at issue? It may seem natural to you, probably does, seems natural to me too, but the issue is whether there's scientific reason to support this natural way of talking, or whether a more specific way of talking, which is less rich, will account for what the children are representing.
I have this sort of brings me to like a much more ground floor question, I think. So you were saying before that the experiments, they don't show that the children are attributing specifically propositional mental states.
Yeah, or even non-propositional mental states, right?
Well, I think this connects with some of the things that Walter said earlier, but I was wondering, like, what other than them avowing, like making explicit utterance, like I believe that they believe that the stuff is no longer in the box. Yeah. What would be the evidential conditions for them attributing beliefs? Because it seems like in absent that condition, them avowing it, it's going to be opaque to us. Like, it's not going to be obvious that they're attributing beliefs. So I want to know what are going to be the evidential conditions, right?
I don't think it'll ever be obvious. I think it'll always be a delicate experimental thing to determine exactly what they're doing. So we'll make that point. I also think that the best evidence we now have is verbal. So the reason I'm persuaded that by 6 years old anyway, children are attributing mental states is they're using language that's close enough. To be sure, I don't think the language shows a complete understanding of belief. In fact, there's a lot of detail here I've left out about how amazingly blind even 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds are to things we regard as fairly obvious about beliefs. So they definitely do not, even at age 6, they don't have anything like an adult mastery of belief. So there are issues about opacity or obliquity in attribution that is very, very poorly mastered by, it's partially mastered, I think, but not well mastered by 5 and 6-year-olds. Nevertheless, I'm making a kind of seat of the pants judgment. Probably 5 and 6-year-olds have it, though I would like to have a firmer grip on this, and I'd like the science to produce firmer evidence about it. So even at the older age, I think it's not completely clear what to say. I don't think it's, I certainly do not hold the view in advance of experimentation that only linguistic evidence could be evidence for mental attribution. In fact, my heart is on the other side. I'm pulling for the view that apes have propositional attitudes. I used to believe surely apes attribute simple mental states to others. So I'm trying to be as open methodologically as possible to the question. So I think your question is my question addressed to the current science. I'm encouraging the science to make its methods of experimentation more subtle and more detailed, so as to maybe find ways of showing that younger children attribute mental states. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I don't think the experiments that have been used so far are nearly sophisticated enough to help us find out whether they do or don't. And I'm not an experimental psychologist, so I don't have detailed experimental methods, but there are things you can find out independently of getting linguistic evidence. So I think an open question about apes is a different one from the one I've been discussing, but I think it's an open question whether apes have propositional attitudes. I mean, there's no question that they have perceptions, and they've got a huge intelligence in using them and so on. But I think it's a rather difficult question. I used to think it was an easy question, but the more I learned about it, I think it's not easy. Do apes have propositional attitudes? They can't tell us they do. They don't use sentences. Once you use sentences, you've got propositional capacities, right? If you don't use sentences, maybe you have propositional capacities and maybe you don't. I'm betting they do, but showing they do is quite a difficult matter. Well, one kind of thing that might show is to show they have behavior that strongly suggests they're engaging in propositional inference. So let me just describe this kind of case. A simple kind of propositional inference would be modus tollendo ponens. So either P or Q, not Q, so P. I think that's an inference form that is likely to be even simpler than modus ponens for non-human animals. At any rate, it's a very simple one. Some apes will do the following: you show the ape that you've got something, and you show you're hiding it in one of two containers, and the ape can't see which container. And then you show the ape one of the containers is empty and put it back down. Will the ape average searching, say, spend a little bit less time on the left container than it did before, and a little more likely to go to the right container, or will the ape go directly to the right container? If it were to go directly to the right container, you might think, well, that looks more like propositional inference, behavioral expression, propositional inference, than just changing the averaging schedule a bit. Unfortunately, I don't think the apes' behavior is decisive on this. They don't go completely directly to the other one. It's a very strong tendency. You can train them so they get stronger and stronger. What do we make of this? Can we account for it in terms of Bayesian probabilistic subjective probabilities, or should we account for it in terms of propositional inference? It's a very delicate experimental matter. I'm pulling for the propositional inference side of this debate, but I don't think it's at all settled. So your question is, I think, putting your finger on something really hard about current cognitive ethology. In the absence of language, how do we test for even propositional attitudes, much less attribution of anything, propositional or representational?
So that was the last answer.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.